On that frozen morning, the engines did not roar with confidence. They groaned. Steel beasts, some of the most feared machines ever built, pushed forward through the snow, not chasing victory, but racing against something far more fragile: fuel. In the heart of the Ardennes Offensive, where the fate of Nazi Germany's last gamble would unfold, commanders like Joachim Peiper were not watching the enemy lines. They were watching their fuel gauges. Each mile forward came at a cost. Each turn of the track consumed what little remained of Germany's lifeblood. The Battle of the Bulge, often remembered for its ferocity and surprise, concealed a quieter truth, one that would ultimately decide its outcome long before the first shot was fired. This was not just a clash of armies, it was a collision between two systems, one running on desperation, the other on abundance. As the Ardennes Offensive began, Adolf Hitler believed he could still rewrite history with one decisive blow. But beneath the surface of this bold plan lay a dangerous illusion. The German fuel crisis had already tightened its grip, turning even the mightiest tanks into liabilities. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, American logistics, relentless, invisible, and overwhelming, were quietly shaping the future. So the question remains: can an army built on steel and strategy survive when it runs on empty? Because in the Battle of the Bulge, the answer would come not from the battlefield, but from the fuel gauge. The winter of 1944 Kabut did not begin with silence. It began with movement fast, deliberate, and filled with a sense of desperate purpose. As the Ardennes Offensive erupted on December 16th, German forces surged through what they believed was a weak point in the American lines. This was not just another attack. It was Adolf Hitler's final gamble to alter the course of the war, a bold strike designed to fracture the Allied front and seize the critical port of Antwerp. On paper, the plan carried a certain ruthless brilliance. 3 German armies, spearheaded by elite panzer divisions, would push through the dense Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and split British and American forces in two. The success of the Ardennes offensive depended on speed, surprise, and above all, momentum. But beneath this ambition lay a fragile truth. The entire operation rested on an assumption that bordered on fantasy: that German forces would capture enough American fuel to sustain their advance. By late 1944, the German fuel crisis had reached catastrophic levels. Allied bombing campaigns had crippled synthetic fuel production, reducing it by nearly 90%. The vital oil fields of Romania were lost. Across the Reich, fuel had become more valuable than ammunition. Tanks were rationed. Aircraft remained grounded. Even civilian life slowed to a crawl under the weight of scarcity. Yet, despite this, the offensive moved forward. Commanders were told they had enough fuel for only a fraction of the journey. The rest, they were assured, would come from the enemy. It was a plan built not on logistics, but on hope. And as the first columns of armor rolled into the snow-covered forest, that hope became the most dangerous weapon of all. At the very tip of the German advance moved a formation that embodied both the strength and the fatal weakness of the Ardennes Offensive Kampfgruppe Peiper. Led by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, this elite unit was the sharp edge of the 6th Panzer Army, tasked with punching through American defenses and racing toward the Meuse River. They were fast, aggressive, and equipped with some of the most formidable machines of the war. The Tiger II and Panther tanks were not just weapons, they were symbols of German engineering dominance. With thick, sloped armor and devastating firepower, they could destroy most Allied tanks before facing serious retaliation. In direct combat, they inspired fear. But beneath that power lay a critical flaw: an unrelenting hunger for fuel. A single Tiger II could consume several gallons of gasoline for every mile it advanced. And in the harsh terrain of the Ardennes, that consumption often doubled. As the Battle of the Bulge intensified, Peiper's advance became a race not against American resistance, but against empty fuel tanks. Still, in the early hours, everything seemed to be working. The surprise was total. American lines fractured. Roads opened. The offensive gained momentum, and for a brief moment, Hitler's desperate gamble appeared to be succeeding. Then, deep within the snow-covered forest near a small Belgian village, the Germans stumbled upon something extraordinary. Hidden among the trees was a massive American fuel depot. Thousands of jerry cans stacked in long rows filled with high-grade gasoline. For soldiers who had spent months rationing every drop, it felt like a miracle. Word spread quickly. Nearly 50,000 gallons of fuel, enough to refuel the entire Kampfgruppe and push them closer to their objective. Laughter returned. Confidence surged. In that fleeting moment, it seemed as if the Ardennes Offensive had found the lifeline it so desperately needed. But what they had discovered was not salvation. It was something far more devastating. The illusion did not shatter all at once. It crept in slowly, almost quietly, as German officers began to examine the details of their unexpected prize. At first glance, the captured fuel depot seemed like a turning point in the Ardennes Offensive. But as documents were reviewed and supply markings studied, a far more unsettling reality began to emerge. The gasoline they had found was not rare. It was recent. Shipping manifests revealed that this fuel, refined thousands of miles away in Texas, had crossed the Atlantic, been unloaded in France, and delivered to the front lines in a matter of weeks. This was not a forgotten reserve or a lucky break. It was part of a continuous industrial flow, a system so vast that losing tens of thousands of gallons barely registered as a disruption. For a German army trapped in the grip of a severe fuel crisis, this realization was devastating. What they had celebrated as a miracle was, in truth, insignificant. And then came the deeper shock. Intelligence reports and captured materials pointed to an even greater force behind American logistics, an expanding network of pipelines capable of delivering hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel every single day. In that moment, the scale of the imbalance became undeniable. A German panzer division might consume such an amount over weeks of intense combat. The Americans could replace it in hours. The numbers alone told a story that no propaganda could hide. This was not a battle they could win through courage or tactical brilliance. Morale began to erode. The belief that the Ardennes Offensive could succeed gave way to a colder understanding that they were fighting an enemy whose resources were effectively limitless. The battlefield had not changed. The tanks were still there. The guns still fired. But in the minds of the soldiers, something had shifted. They were no longer advancing toward victory. They were advancing into inevitability. While German forces struggled against the limits of their own supply, the American war machine operated on an entirely different scale. To understand why the Ardennes Offensive was doomed, one must look beyond the battlefield and into the vast, invisible network that sustained the Allied advance. This was the true strength behind the Battle of the Bulge, American logistics. At the heart of this system was the Red Ball Express, a relentless convoy operation that kept fuel, ammunition, and supplies flowing to the front. Thousands of trucks moved day and night along designated routes, many driven by African-American soldiers whose contribution became one of the most vital yet often overlooked elements of the war. In just a matter of weeks, hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies were delivered across war-torn Europe. The scale was staggering. What Germany struggled to conserve, America could distribute endlessly. But the trucks were only one part of a much larger system. Beneath the English Channel, an engineering achievement known as Operation Pluto pumped fuel directly from Britain to the European mainland. From there, an expanding network of pipelines carried gasoline forward, following the armies as they advanced. It was as if the Allied forces had created their own circulatory system, one that ensured a constant, uninterrupted flow of energy to every division in the field. This overwhelming abundance shaped how American commanders thought about war. Unlike their German counterparts, they did not need to measure every kilometer against remaining fuel reserves. They could plan offensives across entire regions, confident that supply would follow. Fuel was not a constraint, it was a certainty. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, an army calculating every movement based on scarcity. On the other, a force empowered by excess, capable of burning millions of gallons without hesitation. This imbalance did more than determine strategy, it defined the outcome. Long before the fighting reached its peak, the result of the Battle of the Bulge had already been written in pipelines, factories, and fuel depots stretching across an ocean. By the final days of December 1944, the illusion of momentum had completely collapsed. The Ardennes Offensive, once envisioned as a decisive blow, was now unraveling under the weight of its own contradictions. For Kampfgruppe Peiper, the consequences became brutally clear. Their advance had slowed, then stalled, and finally stopped altogether. American resistance stiffened at key points, buying time. But it was not firepower alone that sealed their fate. It was absence. The absence of fuel, the very resource upon which the entire operation depended, had vanished, either consumed, destroyed, or denied. And nowhere was this more devastatingly demonstrated than in the deliberate actions taken by American forces. As German units pushed forward, they encountered not just resistance, but destruction on a scale they could barely comprehend. Fuel depots that might have sustained their advance were systematically set ablaze. Near Stavelot and along critical routes, American engineers followed a simple, ruthless directive. If the enemy needed it, it must not exist. Millions of gallons of gasoline were poured into ditches, ignited, and reduced to pillars of black smoke that marked the horizon. To the German soldiers, this was incomprehensible. They were fighting for every leader, calculating every movement, and here was an enemy willing to destroy vast reserves without hesitation. In a single week, more fuel was burned intentionally by American forces than had been allocated to sustain the entire Ardennes offensive. It was not waste. It was strategy made possible by overwhelming abundance. For Peiper's men, the consequences were immediate. Their once feared Tiger II tanks became immobile hulks, stranded in the snow. Without fuel, their power meant nothing. On Christmas Eve, the order was given to abandon the vehicles. Steel giants, designed to dominate battlefields, were left behind in silence. Out of thousands who began the advance, only a fraction made it back to German lines on foot, exhausted and defeated. They had not been destroyed by superior tanks or tactics alone. They had been defeated by logistics, by an enemy who could afford to fight a war of attrition on a scale they could not match. And in that frozen landscape, surrounded by abandoned armor, the true cost of the Ardennes offensive became impossible to ignore. When the guns finally fell silent in January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was remembered as a dramatic and hard-fought American victory. But in truth, the outcome of the Ardennes offensive had been decided long before the first German tank crossed into the forest. It was not determined solely by courage on the battlefield or brilliance in command, but by something far less visible and far more decisive. The German plan had been built on a fragile illusion. It assumed that speed, surprise, and superior armor could compensate for a collapsing supply system. It relied on capturing fuel from an enemy that possessed it in overwhelming abundance. This was not strategy grounded in reality. It was a gamble born of desperation, shaped by the harsh reality of the German fuel crisis. In contrast, the United States fought a different kind of war. Across the Atlantic, oil fields in Texas produced fuel at a scale Germany could not hope to match. Factories in Detroit transformed raw materials into machines of war at an astonishing pace. Shipyards launched vessels faster than they could be destroyed. And across Europe, American logistics ensured that fuel flowed continuously to the front lines, feeding an army that never had to question its ability to move. The Ardennes offensive became more than just a failed attack. It became a measuring stick, a stark demonstration of the widening gap between two nations. On one side stood an exhausted war machine, running on dwindling reserves and fading belief. On the other stood an industrial colossus, capable of sustaining war on a scale previously unimaginable. For the German soldiers who discovered those fuel depots in the snow, the realization was profound. They had not found a path to victory. They had found proof that victory was already beyond reach. And so the Battle of the Bulge leaves behind a lasting lesson, one that echoes far beyond the winter of 1944. In modern warfare, the greatest weapon is not always the tank, the gun, or the soldier. It is the ability to sustain them, because an army that cannot move cannot win. If this story has made you see the Ardennes offensive from a different perspective, consider what other battles might reveal the same hidden truth. Were there other moments in history where logistics, not tactics, decided the outcome? Share your thoughts below. And if you value these deeper explorations into military history, consider subscribing to continue uncovering the forces that truly shape war. The battle may be over, but the lessons are still being written.